Sarah Martinez stood at attention in the back row of the formation, her uniform crisp despite the sweat beading on her forehead under the scorching Arizona sun. The other recruits towered around her, their shadows casting her small frame in perpetual shade. At barely 5 feet 2 inches, she looked like a child playing dress-up in military fatigues that seemed tailored for giants. "Look at that little mouse trying to be a soldier," whispered Private Johnson from the row ahead, loud enough for several others to hear. A ripple of muffled laughter spread through the ranks like wildfire. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, focusing on the American flag fluttering in the distance. Drill Sergeant Murphy paced in front of the formation, his boots creating small dust clouds with each heavy step. His voice boomed across the parade ground as he called out infractions and corrections. Sarah had learned to make herself invisible during these sessions, knowing that drawing attention usually meant becoming the target of both the sergeant's wrath and her fellow recruits' mockery. The whispers continued behind her. How did she even pass the physical requirements? Maybe they lowered the standards. My little sister could probably do better than her. Each comment was like a small needle, pricking at her resolve. But Sarah had developed thick skin over the past months of basic training. What her fellow recruits didn't know was that Sarah had grown up on a ranch in rural Texas, where being small meant learning to be twice as smart and 3 times as determined. She had spent her childhood wrestling calves, fixing broken fences and working alongside ranch hands who initially dismissed her as the boss's little daughter. By the time she was 16, those same men were asking for her help with the ornery, cattle, and praising her quick thinking during emergencies. The military had been a natural choice for Sarah, not because she wanted to prove something to the world, but because she genuinely believed in serving her country. Her grandfather had fought in Vietnam, and her father had served in the Gulf War. The stories they told around the dinner table weren't about glory or heroism, but about ordinary people doing extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. But basic training was different from anything she had experienced. The constant scrutiny, the deliberate attempts to break down individual identity, and the pack mentality that turned fellow recruits into predators seeking the weakest link. Sarah had become that link, not because she couldn't keep up physically or mentally, but because she looked like an easy target. During combat training exercises, she was always the last one chosen for teams. During mess hall meals, empty seats mysteriously appeared around her table. Even the drill sergeants seemed to view her as a temporary presence, someone who would wash out before graduation. Their attention focused on the recruits they believed had potential, the tall, broad-shouldered men and women who looked like they belonged in recruiting posters. Sarah's only refuge was the shooting range. There her small stature became an advantage. She could find stable positions that larger recruits struggled with, and her steady hands, trained by years of hunting with her grandfather, rarely missed their mark. But even this skill was dismissed by her peers as luck or beginner's fortune. "Anyone can shoot a stationary target," they would say. "Wait until she's under real pressure." The doubts began to creep into Sarah's own mind during the quieter moments. Late at night in her bunk, listening to the whispered conversations and stifled laughter from across the barracks, she wondered if everyone else could see something she couldn't. Maybe she really was kidding herself. Maybe her family's encouragement had been nothing more than polite support for a foolish dream. Her phone calls home became less frequent. She couldn't bear to hear the hope in her mother's voice or the pride in her father's questions about her progress. How could she explain that she was technically passing all the requirements but failing to earn the respect of anyone around her? How could she admit that she felt more isolated now than she ever had growing up as the smallest kid in her small-town high school? The weeks blended together in a haze of physical training, classroom instruction, and social isolation. Sarah learned to eat quickly and leave the mess hall before the comments started. She volunteered for extra duties that kept her busy during free time when the mockery usually intensified. She threw herself into studying military regulations and procedures, memorizing everything with an intensity that bordered on obsession. What sustained her was a stubborn streak inherited from generations of Martinez women who had faced down droughts, economic hardships, and social prejudice. Her great-grandmother had run the ranch during World War II when all the men were overseas. Her grandmother had been the first woman elected to the local school board in their conservative county. Her mother had built a successful veterinary practice in a field dominated by men. Sarah might be small, and she might be ridiculed, But she was not weak. Every morning, she woke up with the same determination that had carried her family through decades of challenges. She would prove herself not through words or arguments, but through actions and results. She would graduate from basic training, not because it was easy, but because quitting was not in her DNA. As the formation continued its drills under the blazing sun, Sarah felt the familiar burn in her muscles and the sting of sweat in her eyes. Around her, the whispers and comments continued, but they seemed to fade into background noise. She had learned to find strength in solitude and purpose in persistence. Whatever came next, she would face it the way her family had taught her to face everything, with her head held high and her feet planted firmly on the ground. The obstacle course had always been Sarah's greatest challenge, not because she lacked the physical ability, but because it became a public spectacle for her tormentors. Every Tuesday and Friday, the entire company gathered to watch each other navigate the series of walls, ropes, and barriers that tested both strength and agility. For most recruits, it was an opportunity to showcase their capabilities. For Sarah, it was 2 hours of organized humiliation. "Martinez, you're up." Drill Sergeant Murphy's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. Sarah stepped forward, ignoring the theatrical groans and eye rolls from her fellow recruits. She had learned to tune out the commentary that inevitably followed her name being called. The course began with a 6-foot wall that required a running leap and upper body strength to clear. Sarah had developed her own technique, using her momentum and finding toeholds that others missed. As she approached the wall, she heard the familiar chorus behind her. "She'll never make it. Watch her bounce off like a rubber ball." This is painful to watch. But Sarah cleared the wall on her first attempt, dropping silently to the other side while others were still placing bets on how many tries it would take her. The rope climb came next, and here her ranch background served her well. Years of climbing barn lofts and tree stands had given her technique that compensated for her lack of raw power. While larger recruits muscled their way up through brute force, Sarah moved with efficiency, conserving energy and maintaining steady progress. The crawl under barbed wire was where her small size became a clear advantage. While others scraped their backs and shoulders on the low-hanging obstacles, Sarah slithered through with room to spare. She began to pull ahead of the pack, her technique refined through weeks of private practice during off hours when the course was empty and the mocking voices were silent. "Look at her go," someone called out, and for a moment Sarah thought she might have earned some grudging respect. But the comment was followed by laughter and a response that cut deep. "Yeah, like a little rat through a sewer pipe. Finally found something she's built for." The final obstacle was a rope swing over a mud pit, followed by a sprint to the finish line. Sarah had failed this element repeatedly in previous attempts, lacking the momentum to clear the pit consistently, but today felt different. Her confidence was building with each successful obstacle, and the jeers from the sidelines seemed to fuel rather than deflate her energy. She grabbed the rope and launched herself across the pit. For a moment she hung suspended in the air, and the voices of her detractors fell silent. She landed cleanly on the far side and broke into a sprint that surprised everyone, including herself. Her feet barely seemed to touch the ground as she flew past the finish line. When the dust settled and times were announced, Sarah had posted the third best result of the day. The silence from her fellow recruits was deafening. Drill Sergeant Murphy looked at his stopwatch twice as if questioning the accuracy of the reading. For the first time in months, Sarah allowed herself a small smile, but the victory was short-lived. By evening chow, the narrative had already been rewritten by her critics. The course must have been set up wrong. She probably got a head start. Third place out of 30 people isn't exactly impressive. The goalposts had moved, as they always did when Sarah showed competence. What hurt most wasn't the continued dismissal of her abilities, but the realization that nothing she did would ever be enough to change their minds. She could outrun, outshoot, and outperform half the company, but she would always be seen as the little girl playing soldier. The prejudice wasn't based on her actual capabilities, but on their preconceived notions about what a soldier should look like. That night, Sarah lay in her bunk staring at the ceiling, wrestling with thoughts that had been building for weeks. Maybe it was time to accept reality. Maybe she was fighting a battle that couldn't be won. The military clearly had a prototype in mind for its ideal soldier, and she would never fit that mold no matter how hard she tried. She thought about her life back home, where her size had been just another characteristic rather than a defining limitation. The ranch work had been challenging, but it was honest work where results spoke louder than appearances. Her friends and family judged her by her character and contributions, not by whether she looked the part of whatever role she was filling. The next morning brought a new training exercise, urban warfare simulation. The company would be divided into teams and sent through a mock city environment to practice room clearing and tactical movement. Sarah approached the assignment with resignation rather than enthusiasm, expecting to be placed with the weakest performers or left out entirely. To her surprise, she was assigned to Team Alpha, one of the higher-performing groups. The team leader, Private Rodriguez, was known for his tactical intelligence and no-nonsense approach to training. As they huddled for the mission briefing, Sarah waited for the inevitable protest about her inclusion. Instead, Rodriguez looked directly at her and said, "Martinez, you're taking point on the third building. Your size will be an advantage in those tight corridors, and your shooting scores indicate you can handle the pressure." It was the first time in months that a fellow recruit had acknowledged her abilities without qualification or mockery. The urban warfare exercise would prove to be a turning point, though Sarah didn't realize it at the time. As she checked her equipment and reviewed the building blueprints, she felt something she hadn't experienced since arriving at basic training: anticipation rather than dread. For the first time, she would be entering a situation where her unique characteristics might be valued rather than mocked. The morning sun cast long shadows between the mock buildings as Team Alpha prepared to begin their mission. Sarah adjusted her helmet and checked her weapon one final time. Behind her, she could hear other teams receiving their briefings and the familiar sound of her name being mentioned with skeptical laughter. But for once, the mockery seemed distant and irrelevant. She had a job to do, and she intended to do it well. The mock city stretched before them like a concrete maze, complete with narrow alleyways, multi-story buildings, and hidden sniper positions. Sarah's heart pounded as Team Alpha approached their first objective, but it was excitement rather than fear driving her pulse. For the first time in months, she felt like she belonged somewhere. Rodriguez gave the signal and the team moved into formation. Sarah took her position at the rear initially, watching how the larger members of the team moved through the urban environment. What she observed was telling. Their size, which looked so impressive on the parade ground, became a liability in the cramped spaces between buildings. They had to duck under overhangs, squeeze through narrow passages, and constantly adjust their movement to accommodate their bulk. When they reached the third building, Rodriguez motioned for Sarah to take the lead. The structure was a 3-story mock apartment complex with narrow stairwells and tight corners, designed to simulate real urban combat conditions. As Sarah approached the entrance, she could hear whispered doubts from some team members behind her. "This is a mistake," Private Coleman muttered. "She's going to get us all killed in there." But Rodriguez held firm. "Martinez knows what she's doing. Trust the plan." Sarah entered the building with fluid movements that surprised even her. The tight spaces that would challenge larger soldiers felt natural to her, like navigating the narrow passages of the old barn back home. She could move quickly and quietly, checking corners and clearing rooms with an efficiency that came from instinct rather than overthinking. The first room contained 2 target silhouettes positioned to simulate armed hostiles. Sarah's shots were precise and immediate, center mass on both targets before her teammates had even entered the room. The sound of her rifle echoed through the building, followed by an impressed whistle from Rodriguez. "Clean shots, Martinez. Keep moving." As they progressed through the building, Sarah's confidence grew with each successful room clearing. Her small stature allowed her to use cover more effectively, and her quick reflexes served her well in the close-quarters environment. When they encountered a simulated hostage situation in one of the upper rooms, she was able to position herself for a shot that larger team members couldn't have taken without exposing themselves to return fire. The exercise concluded with Team Alpha posting the fastest time and highest accuracy rating of the day. As they emerged from the building, Sarah was surprised to see several drill sergeants observing their performance. Sergeant Murphy nodded approvingly as he reviewed their scores, and for the first time, his expression when looking at Sarah wasn't one of skeptical disappointment. But the real surprise came during the debrief session. Rodriguez stood before the entire company and presented his team's performance analysis. When he reached Sarah's contributions, his words carried weight that couldn't be dismissed or explained away. "Private Martinez was instrumental in our success today," he announced. Her tactical movement in confined spaces was textbook, and her shooting under pressure was outstanding. She demonstrated exactly why diverse skill sets make teams stronger. The silence that followed was different from the usual dismissive quiet that greeted Sarah's rare moments of recognition. This time, it felt like genuine consideration rather than polite tolerance. Some recruits looked thoughtful, others surprised, but the automatic mockery was notably absent. Later that evening, something unprecedented happened. Private Williams, one of the more vocal critics of Sarah's presence in the company, approached her during evening cleaning duties. His expression was serious rather than confrontational, and his tone lacked the usual mocking edge. "I owe you an apology," he said quietly. "I've been assuming you didn't belong here without actually paying attention to what you could do. Today opened my eyes." Sarah was so shocked she almost dropped the rifle she was cleaning. Williams had been one of the worst offenders when it came to the constant commentary about her size and abilities. His admission was unexpected and, frankly, a little suspicious. "I don't need your pity," she replied carefully. "It's not pity," Williams insisted. "It's respect. I watched you in that building today, and you moved like you'd been doing urban combat for years. The rest of us were stumbling around like amateur hour." Other recruits had begun to notice the conversation, and Sarah felt the familiar weight of attention that usually preceded embarrassment. But this time the faces around her showed curiosity, rather than anticipation of entertainment. Private Thompson, another frequent critic, joined the conversation. "Williams is right. I've been focusing on all the wrong things. You've been outperforming most of us on the shooting range for weeks, and today proved you can apply those skills under pressure." Sarah found herself in uncharted territory. For months she had fantasized about moments like this, when her abilities would finally be recognized and respected. But now that it was happening, she felt wary rather than vindicated. Trust once broken was not easily rebuilt. "Why now?" she asked. "What's changed?" Rodriguez, who had been listening from nearby, joined the group. "What's changed is that you finally got a chance to show what you're really capable of in a situation that mattered. And more importantly, the rest of us finally stopped making assumptions long enough to pay attention." The conversation continued for several more minutes, with other team members sharing observations about Sarah's performance that day. For the first time since arriving at basic training, Sarah felt like she was being seen as an individual rather than a stereotype. It was gratifying but also overwhelming. As the group dispersed and evening routine continued, Sarah reflected on the day's events. The validation felt good, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it shouldn't have taken months of proving herself for her fellow recruits to recognize her capabilities. How many other people were being overlooked or dismissed because they didn't fit someone's preconceived notion of what success looked like? More importantly, she wondered if this newfound respect would last, or if it was just temporary goodwill that would fade the next time she faced a challenge that didn't play to her strengths. Trust was fragile, and Sarah had learned to be protective of her own confidence. She would accept the recognition gracefully, but she wouldn't let herself become dependent on external validation again. The respect Sarah had earned during the urban warfare exercise proved more durable than she had expected. Over the following weeks, the dynamic within her company began to shift in subtle but meaningful ways. She was no longer automatically assigned to the weakest teams during group exercises. Her opinions during tactical discussions were actually solicited and considered. The mess hall conversations that had once fallen silent upon her approach now included her as a natural participant. But the most significant change was in Sarah herself. Months of isolation and mockery had taught her to question her own judgment and abilities. Now, with external validation matching her internal sense of competence, she began to rediscover the confidence that had carried her through challenges back home. She spoke up more during briefings, volunteered for leadership roles in training exercises, and stopped apologizing for taking up space. The shift didn't go unnoticed by the drill sergeants. Sergeant Murphy, who had previously treated Sarah as an unfortunate necessity to be endured until she inevitably washed out, began paying serious attention to her development. During a particularly challenging field navigation exercise, he pulled her aside for what she assumed would be another lecture about keeping up with the group. Instead, he surprised her with genuine curiosity about her background. "Where did you learn to read terrain like that, Martinez?" he asked, referencing her flawless performance with map and compass during the exercise. "Growing up on a ranch, Sergeant," Sarah replied. You learn to read the land when you're tracking lost cattle or finding the best routes through rough country. Murphy nodded thoughtfully. It shows. Your fieldcraft is better than recruits who've been hunting their whole lives. Have you given any thought to what you want to do after basic training? The question caught Sarah off guard. For months, she had been so focused on simply surviving basic training that she hadn't allowed herself to think seriously about what came next. The assumption, both her own and apparently everyone else's, had been that graduation was unlikely. I haven't really thought that far ahead, Sergeant, she admitted. Well, you should start thinking about it, Murphy said. You've got skills that would translate well to several different military occupational specialties. Don't sell yourself short when it comes time to make those decisions. That evening, Sarah found herself researching different career paths within the military with genuine interest rather than desperate hope. Intelligence analysis appealed to her methodical nature. Special operations support roles seemed to value the kind of unconventional thinking that had served her well in recent training exercises. For the first time, she began to see the military not as a series of obstacles to overcome, but as a place where she might actually build a meaningful career. The weeks leading up to graduation took on a different quality. Training that had once felt like endurance tests became opportunities to refine skills she was genuinely excited to use. The camaraderie that had developed within her company felt authentic rather than polite. Sarah began to allow herself to believe that she had found her place in the world. But the real test of how much things had changed came during the final field exercise, a 3-day simulation that would put together everything they had learned during basic training. Companies were divided into opposing forces and sent into a large training area to conduct simulated combat operations. Success would be measured not just on individual performance, but on how well units worked together under pressure. Sarah was selected as a team leader for the first time, responsible for a squad of 8 recruits in a reconnaissance mission deep behind simulated enemy lines. The appointment came with mixed reactions from her assigned team members. While some were genuinely supportive, others remained skeptical about following orders from someone they still saw as the smallest and least imposing member of the company. No offense, Martinez, said Private Jackson during the mission planning session. But how are you going to command respect from enemy forces if we get captured? You look like somebody's little sister. It was the kind of comment that would have devastated Sarah months earlier, striking at every insecurity she had carried since arriving at basic training. But now, with hard-earned confidence backing her up, she was able to respond with calm authority. Jackson, my job is to make sure we don't get captured by outthinking the opposition and executing our mission flawlessly. If you're planning to get caught, maybe you should request a transfer to a different team. The response earned a few chuckles from other team members and seemed to settle the matter. Jackson nodded reluctantly and focused on the mission briefing without further commentary. The 3-day exercise tested every skill they had developed, and several they hadn't realized they possessed. Sarah's team was tasked with gathering intelligence on enemy positions while avoiding detection by opposing forces. It required patience, precision, and the kind of tactical thinking that couldn't be taught in classroom sessions. Sarah found herself drawing on instincts developed during childhood games of hide-and-seek in the ranch's vast acreage, combined with technical skills learned through months of military training. Her small size, once a source of embarrassment, became a tactical advantage in concealment and movement. Her ability to remain calm under pressure, developed through years of handling ranch emergencies, served her well when plans had to be changed quickly. By the second day, her team had successfully completed 2 reconnaissance objectives without detection, while other squads were being eliminated through exposure or tactical errors. The success bred confidence within the group, and Sarah noticed that her orders were being followed without hesitation or second-guessing. On the final day, they encountered an unexpected situation that would test everything Sarah had learned about leadership and decision-making. While observing an enemy position, they discovered that a friendly squad had been captured and was being held in a simulated prisoner compound. The mission parameters called for intelligence gathering only, but Sarah faced a choice between following orders and attempting a rescue operation. The decision she made would prove to be the defining moment of her basic training experience, though she wouldn't understand its full significance until much later. As she studied the compound through binoculars and weighed her options, Sarah realized that this was exactly the kind of situation where unconventional thinking and calculated risk-taking could make the difference between mission success and failure. Sarah studied the simulated prison compound through her binoculars, her mind racing through tactical possibilities. The captured squad consisted of 4 recruits she had trained alongside for months, including Rodriguez, who had been the first to recognize her capabilities. Standard protocol dictated that she should report the situation and continue with her assigned reconnaissance mission. But something deeper than military doctrine was driving her decision-making process. "What's the call, Martinez?" whispered Private Chen, one of her team members who had become a reliable ally over recent weeks. "Do we stick to the mission or try to help them?" Sarah lowered her binoculars and looked at the faces of her squad. These were people who had learned to trust her judgment, and their confidence was both empowering and terrifying. Whatever decision she made would affect not just her own military career, but the evaluation of everyone under her command. "We're going to attempt a rescue," she said quietly. "But we're going to do it smart. Chen, I need you to create a diversion on the north side of the compound in exactly 15 minutes. Williams, you and Thompson will provide overwatch from that ridge. Jackson, you're with me for the actual extraction." The plan was audacious and technically outside the scope of their assigned mission. If it failed, Sarah would likely face serious consequences during the evaluation process. But as she watched the captured recruits sitting in the simulated prison area, she realized that some decisions couldn't be made based on personal safety or career considerations. Her team moved into position with the kind of coordinated precision that surprised even Sarah. Months of training had created instinctive understanding of movement and communication that needed no verbal instruction. As she and Jackson approached the compound's weak point, Sarah felt the familiar calm that had served her well during ranch emergencies and urban warfare exercises. The rescue operation unfolded with almost textbook efficiency. Chen's diversion drew the opposing force guards to the north perimeter, while Sarah and Jackson infiltrated from the south. Using hand signals learned during close quarters training, Sarah directed the released prisoners toward their planned extraction route, while Jackson provided security. Within 12 minutes, all 4 captured recruits had been freed and were moving toward the rally point. The opposing force realized what had happened and began pursuit. But Sarah's team had planned for that contingency. Williams and Thompson provided covering fire from their overwatch position, while the main group moved through terrain that favored small, mobile units over larger pursuing forces. By evening, Sarah's squad had completed both their original reconnaissance mission and the improvised rescue operation without losing a single team member. When they reached the final checkpoint and reported to the exercise controllers, Sarah was unsure whether she would be commended or court-martialed. Drill Sergeant Murphy was waiting at the debriefing station with an expression that gave away nothing about his assessment of the day's events. As Sarah's team approached, she steeled herself for whatever consequences her decision might bring. "Interesting day, Martinez," Murphy said, consulting his notes. "You were assigned a reconnaissance mission. Care to explain why your team conducted an unauthorized rescue operation?" Sarah stood at attention and chose her words carefully. "Sergeant, we encountered a situation where fellow soldiers were in simulated danger. I made a tactical decision that the potential intelligence value of the rescue operation outweighed the risks to our primary mission." "And did you consider that your unauthorized action could have compromised not just your own mission, but the overall exercise objectives?" "Yes, Sergeant. But I also considered that leaving fellow soldiers in enemy hands when we had the capability to help them was inconsistent with military values, as I understand them." Murphy studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Around them, other drill sergeants and exercise observers had gathered to listen to the exchange. Sarah could feel the weight of their attention, but her confidence in her decision remained unshaken. "Your primary mission?" Murphy asked. "Completed successfully, Sergeant. All reconnaissance objectives were achieved, and intelligence was gathered on enemy positions, strength, and movement patterns. Casualties during the rescue operation?" "None, Sergeant. All personnel returned safely." Murphy made several notes on his evaluation sheet before looking up again. "Martinez, initiative and independent thinking are valuable military qualities, but they must be balanced with discipline and adherence to orders. What you did today was either excellent tactical leadership or dangerous insubordination, depending on your perspective." Sarah felt her stomach tighten, but she maintained her composure. "I understand, Sergeant. However," Murphy continued, and Sarah detected what might have been the hint of a smile. The results speak for themselves. Your team accomplished more in one day than some squads manage in the entire exercise. The rescue operation was executed with minimal resources and no casualties. That takes planning, leadership, and tactical competence. Relief flooded through Sarah, but she remained at attention while Murphy completed his evaluation. Around them, she could hear whispered conversations among the other drill sergeants, but their words were indistinct. Your team will receive full credit for mission completion, Murphy announced. The rescue operation will be noted as exceptional initiative under simulated combat conditions. Well done, all of you. As the formal debriefing concluded and the team was dismissed, Sarah felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond personal validation. She had made a difficult decision under pressure and seen it through to successful completion. More importantly, she had discovered that leadership wasn't about physical presence or intimidating authority, but about earning trust through competence and making decisions based on principle rather than convenience. Rodriguez approached her as they walked back toward the company area. "Thank you," he said simply. "What you did today was real leadership." "You would have done the same thing," Sarah replied. "Maybe," Rodriguez said, "but I wasn't in position to make that call. You were, and you made the right decision even when it could have cost you personally." That night, as Sarah cleaned her equipment and prepared for the final day of basic training, she reflected on how much had changed since those early weeks of mockery and isolation. She had arrived at basic training hoping to prove that she belonged in the military. Instead, she had discovered that belonging wasn't something that could be granted by others, but something that had to be claimed through consistent demonstration of character and competence. The girl who had stood in the back row of formation, enduring whispered comments about her size and suitability, had evolved into a confident leader, capable of making tactical decisions under pressure. Tomorrow would bring graduation and the beginning of her actual military career, but tonight she felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Graduation day dawned with the kind of crisp, clear morning that made everything seem possible. Sarah stood in formation for the final time as a basic training recruit, her uniform pressed to perfection and her boots reflecting the early sunlight like mirrors. The transformation from the uncertain girl who had arrived months earlier was complete, though she understood now that the real change had been internal rather than external. The parade ground buzzed with the energy of families arriving to witness the ceremony. Parents, spouses, and siblings filled the bleacher sections, cameras ready to capture the moment when their loved ones officially became soldiers. Sarah's parents had driven across 3 states to be present, and she could see her father's proud smile from across the field. Colonel Harrison, the base commander, took the podium as the ceremony began. He was a decorated veteran whose reputation preceded him throughout the installation. Stories circulated about his combat experience and his exacting standards for military excellence. When Colonel Harrison spoke, even the most senior drill sergeants listened with respectful attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," the colonel began, his voice carrying easily across the assembled crowd. "Today we recognize the completion of basic military training by 112 new soldiers. These men and women have demonstrated their commitment to service and their readiness to defend our nation." Sarah listened to the colonel's opening remarks while scanning the faces of her fellow graduates. The same people who had once questioned her presence now stood proudly beside her as equals and comrades. The journey from isolation to integration had been difficult, but it had also been transformative for everyone involved. "Military service," Colonel Harrison continued, "requires more than physical strength or technical competence. It demands character, integrity, and the courage to act decisively when circumstances require it. Some of the recruits graduating today have already demonstrated these qualities in remarkable ways." The ceremony proceeded through various recognitions and awards. Sarah watched as her fellow graduates received honors for marksmanship, physical fitness, and academic achievement. She felt genuine pride in their accomplishments, understanding now that individual success within a military unit contributed to collective strength. "This year's Leadership Award," Colonel Harrison announced, "recognizes a recruit who demonstrated exceptional tactical thinking, personal courage, and commitment to fellow soldiers during our final training exercise." Sarah felt her attention sharpen, though she had no expectation of recognition. Leadership awards typically went to the most visible and traditionally impressive recruits. not to someone who had spent most of basic training trying to prove she belonged. The recipient of this award, the colonel continued, planned and executed a complex rescue operation that demonstrated initiative, tactical competence, and adherence to military values. Despite being given a reconnaissance mission, this individual recognized that circumstances required adaptation and took action that resulted in the safe recovery of captured personnel. A murmur of interest rippled through the audience as parents and guests tried to identify who might have earned such recognition. Sarah found herself thinking about Rodriguez or Williams, both of whom had shown consistent leadership throughout training. Private Sarah Martinez, Colonel Harrison announced, his voice carrying clearly across the silent parade ground. Please step forward. Sarah felt as though the world had stopped moving. Around her, fellow graduates turned with expressions of surprise and approval, but she barely registered their reactions. Her legs seemed to move of their own accord as she stepped out of formation and marched toward the podium. The walk across the parade ground felt endless, each step measured and deliberate while her mind struggled to process what was happening. She could see her parents in the stands, her mother's hands pressed to her mouth in shock and her father's proud tears visible even from a distance. Colonel Harrison waited at attention as Sarah approached and came to a halt before him. Up close, she could see the ribbons and decorations that marked his distinguished career, and she felt the weight of recognition from someone whose opinion carried real significance. Private Martinez, the colonel said, his voice now intended for her alone, though it was amplified across the field. Your actions during the final training exercise demonstrated the kind of leadership and moral courage that defines the best of our military tradition. You faced a difficult decision and chose to prioritize the welfare of fellow soldiers while still accomplishing your assigned mission. He presented her with a certificate and medal while continuing his remarks. Your size was never your limitation, Private Martinez. Your character was always your strength. You've proven that true leadership comes from competence, integrity, and the courage to do what's right regardless of personal consequences. As Sarah accepted the award, she thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment. The months of doubt and ridicule seemed like ancient history now, replaced by hard-earned confidence and genuine belonging. She had set out to prove that she could be a soldier despite her size, but had discovered instead that her size was irrelevant to her capabilities. The ceremony concluded with the traditional changing of rank insignia, transforming recruits into soldiers in a ritual that marked the end of one phase of military life and the beginning of another. As Sarah's drill sergeant pinned the new rank onto her uniform, he leaned close enough to speak quietly. You proved me wrong, Martinez, Sergeant Murphy said. I thought you'd wash out in the first month. Instead, you've shown what real soldiers are made of. Good luck in your next assignment. The formal ceremony gave way to celebration as families reunited with their newly graduated soldiers. Sarah found herself surrounded by her parents, whose pride was evident in every word and gesture. Her father, a man of few words, simply embraced her while her mother bombarded her with questions about her experiences and future plans. We always knew you had it in you, her mother said, holding the Leadership Award certificate with reverent care. But seeing you recognized like this makes everything official. As the day wore on and families began to depart, Sarah's fellow graduates approached her with congratulations and respect that felt entirely genuine. The mockery and doubt that had characterized her early weeks of training had been replaced by admiration, earned through demonstrated competence. Rodriguez, whose rescue had earned Sarah her recognition, summed up the transformation best. You taught all of us something important, Martinez. We learned not to judge capability by appearance, and you learned not to let other people's limitations define your own possibilities. Standing on the parade ground as the sun began to set, Sarah reflected on the lessons of the past months. She had come to basic training hoping to find acceptance, and had discovered instead something more valuable. The knowledge that belonging wasn't something others could grant or deny, but something that had to be claimed through persistent demonstration of character and competence. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as she began her military career in earnest. But tonight she was content to savor the moment when all the doubters had finally been silenced, not by arguments or protests, but by results that spoke louder than any words ever could.